Good evening. We're going to start by acknowledging country, and this report has been researched, drafted and composed in the Eastern Kulin country in Melbourne, in Victoria, the Yurin country of the south coast of New South Wales, and the Irukandji and Yidinji land in Cairns, Far North Queensland. The learned friends acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and have conducted ourselves as guests on country, as an non-Indigenous initiated member of the Tutulag and the Kukulag clans. I can vouch for that as being true and correct. The documents considered for this assignment have been the unit text connecting with law, the reception and status of law, an article by the Adelaide Law Review, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the proposed model for the voice, hereafter just referred to as the voice, and several other papers and acts and media reports that support the commentary based around this assignment. Our question: the reception of English law and its subsequent application has resulted in the systemic destruction of Australian Indigenous culture. This paper refers to connecting with law, the reception and the status of English law, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the proposed model for the voice. Will the Statement from the Heart and the voice contribute to improved recognition of Indigenous Australians, their customs and laws, providing a true integration of English law, and will it be supported by the Australian people? So, at the introductory stage, we looked at the reception of English law and its validity. Castle discusses this and mentions, in part, commerce and succession. However, he focuses on the issue raised by Blackstone's commentary, being that only so much law has been received as is required, and yet the application of this law has been as though all English law was received. Further, and in short, it's this application, having been received in its entirety, was really ultra vires because of the premise of terra nullius. We note that in 1967 the referendum recognised Indigenous Australians and allowed the Commonwealth to make laws affecting them. We further note that Mabo No. 2 versus Queensland, the High Court case, ended the myth of terra nullius, but subsequently little has been successfully effected to change the fortunes of Indigenous Australian people. The Uluru Statement from the Heart asks for 6 things: a recognition of 60,000 years of Indigenous culture, a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution, a basis of coexistent sovereignty, as the systematic eradication of Indigenous poverty, incarceration, and a means of establishing genuine opportunity, seeking real outcomes for closing the gap. A makarata, meaning a coming together after a struggle, commission, as an agreement-making process between governments and First Nations peoples. So in simple terms, think of multiple treaties. And 6th, a truth-telling about Australian history, and we add from 1788. An economy is made up of a tripod of land, labour and capital. But when you remove one leg of a tripod, it collapses, and subsequently so too does any society that is based on that economy or relies on it. This has happened in Australia by excluding Indigenous people access to the land, but it was only legally possible because reception of English law was bent around the myth of terra nullius. Now, the Old Testament in the Christian Bible notes in Psalm 96 that if today you hear his voice, harden not your heart. Well, we rewrite this in reverse, saying that if today you hear the statement from the heart, give it a voice. Harden not your heart, but give it a voice. However, there are many obstacles or hurdles to be passed before that can be achieved, even from the point of this commentary in January 2023. The voice itself, well, where the statement of the heart is a summary, the voice is a detailed project plan. It references closing the gap, which in turn references unfinished business from the 1987 Royal Commission into black deaths in custody. Will it work? Well, we can't answer that at this point. We can only predict. But what we can predict is, and what can be really well argued, is that where advice has been ignored and it's followed by a policy or project failure, there will likely be fairly significant political consequences for those who ignored the advice. What will the structure of the voice be? Well, at the national level, there will be 24 representatives. and these representatives, as a body, can ask for and can offer advice to and from the government and to and from Parliament. It explicitly states it does not want to replicate the old ATSIC model. This diagram gives you an indication of how where those representatives will come from. Now, the largest states, being Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia, and indeed the Northern Territory, have a 2+1, and the +1 in all instances is to allow for rural and remote representation. In the case of the Torres Straits, it's to allow for mainland Torres Strait Islanders to be represented within the Torres Strait Island voice. And it kind of makes sense given that there's only about 7,500 Torres Strait Islanders living in the Straits, with 45,000 plus living on the mainland. It mimics, in some respects, the Australian system of government, where there will be a national representation, a regional representation, and local representation. So what's going to change? Well, this structure changes the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the government from a top-down model to a bottom-up model, and more about that in a moment. And hopefully that will result in real outcomes and probably some genuine economic savings. Will it be supported by the Australian people? Well, historically, all referendums at the moment have an 18% chance of success. Now, Stephen Hawking said that the past is no indication of the future. So who knows? But I note that it's far easier to bulldoze a street full of houses than what it is to build them. And the same is true where the pre-referendum campaign for the voice is mishandled. If you want a recent example of this, consider the failed attempt at becoming a republic in 1999-2000. Enough said there. However, that was 23 years ago, and the times have changed a lot since then. So what's in favour of success at this point in time? Well, firstly, the nature and makeup of federal parliament. Both the major parties have a primary vote in the 30% range. Just make this really clear. To divide and rule is very easy, and it's even older than Machiavelli. But coming back to the parliament, the federal parliament in 2023 is no longer all white and all male. Okay, there's a lot of women, there's a lot of non-Caucasian Australians, and there's a lot of people who are either independent or made up from minor parties, and the independents in particular are not answerable to any particular party line, and they are indeed answerable to their electorates. The other risks involved, so that is in favour of a change taking place or the referendum getting up. The risk is that there are elements of Parliament from all sides who are really only there for the salary and the celebrity. In particular, I'm referring to the Greens member who is Indigenous and absolutely vocal in her opposition to any form of voice as it stands, for reasons best left for her to explain. Further, there is undoubtedly an element of racism within the Australian Party. The National Party has come out early and said we're not going to support it. Barnaby Joyce has said he doesn't want an referendum based on race. Well, if that's the case, wind this back 55 years, he would have been against a referendum for changing the Constitution to recognise Aboriginal people, as per the wording of the question back in 67. Did I mention One Nation? Again, enough said at this point. The history of referendums in Australia, directly from the Australian Electoral Commission, notes there have been 19 referendums requesting 44 changes, of which only 8 have come up. That's where we get the 18% chance of success. On the premise that it passes Parliament and the change to the Constitution gets up and the voice is indeed established, Learned Friends contends that it will be supported by Australia. The reason why is that even in the last 6 years, okay, we talked about the 1999-2000 failed attempt at becoming a republic. A lot has changed in Australia since then, and if you want an example of that, in the year 2000, a same-sex marriage bill never would have made it through Parliament. We didn't even need to have the changes to the 1961 Marriage Act go to a referendum. It was just done through a postal vote, and it got up. So there's a lot changed since the year 2000, and we actually believe that where it gets up, because of that change, both in the electorate and in the Parliament, that it has potential to make a significant change for the betterment of Indigenous circumstance. Okay, at this point the bibliography is incomplete, and we're drafting this video before the entirety of the report is done, so if you want to have a look at the bibliography, please refer to the written report. And lastly, I want to give a couple of examples of top-down failure versus bottom-up success. Now, we do not know if the bottom-up model, as proposed by the Voice, will actually succeed, but not having tried it, we can't honestly comment. However, what can be unequivocally stated, and if you look at the evidence for the Closing the Gap report, the top-down model is an abject failure with catastrophic effects for Indigenous peoples in this country. You can't argue with the numbers. Let me give you a couple of examples of how top-down service delivery models fail. These two examples, in one instance my source has since passed, so we can't refer to that. Well, I can't proof it. Ditto the other example about the healthcare service in remote and regional Australia. The person who provided me with this information has requested their privacy. Where need be, I'm prepared to swear a stat dec and or an affidavit to support what I'm saying is true. I just need to respect people's privacy. Okay, so the first example is that in a remote Indigenous community where the only non-Indigenous people in the community are either school teachers or healthcare providers, so a town of about 500 people with maybe 25 non-Indigenous people around about, that might include a couple of police from whatever state I'm referring to. A couple of new doctors, this happened just before Christmas, a couple of new white doctors, and I used that reference strictly within the context of the report, came to town and asked a nurse, whom I know personally, who's been in this community and very well integrated and embedded in the town there, knowing everybody, for about 8 years. The doctor said, look, we should put on a barbecue so we can meet the people and they can get to know us. And the nurse advised that it would not work and that this town doesn't operate that way, and you should consider, if this is what you want to achieve, you should consider this, that and the other thing. But if you put on a barbecue, people are just going to turn up, take the food and go away. Being doctors and being, I say this deliberately, being white doctors in an Indigenous community, they ignored the nurse, and guess what happened? They put on a barbecue. People turned up to the barbecue in a vehicle, leant out the window and said, I'll have 2 sausages and 3 steak sandwiches please, grabbed them and drove off and ate the food in their home. Well, they'd turn up on a push bike or on a motorbike, and instead of what the doctors had hoped, to stand around with a meal and a drink or something, they didn't speak to anyone other than handing food. They were standing beside the hot plate, handing out food like a couple of checkout staff in a McDonald's drive-through. Here's your fries, next please. Literally. Because they didn't listen to the local knowledge. Now, I've seen this time and time again where, and again, I say this strictly within the context of of this report, that a highly educated white public servant will fly in from Brisbane or Canberra to a remote Indigenous community with a clipboard, walk around town, make their assessments with either speaking to one person or the wrong people or nobody, and then go back and write a policy paper, push the policy paper through a budget process, and then come back and do a review in 4 years' time or 3 years' time, depending on whether it's state or federal, and be completely amazed that with less than 8 hours worth of review and 0 consultation, that they'd wasted the money and the objects of the project had failed. Really? Okay, let me give you another example of how the cross-communication can just be an utter failure. And amusing in some ways, with again a top-down model. This was shared with me by a senior case manager with the National Native Title Tribunal back in the early 2000s, who's since passed, so no names. He was Indigenous. He said to me that the Western Australian Department of Education needed to build a new school in a town in the Pilbara, and they were discussing with Indigenous people on what they should name the school. And universally, the answer was, quote unquote, Jumbotty should name that school. So when the school was built, they made the plaque, they screwed it on the wall, and some dignitary or politician pulled the curtain, and the school is named Jumbotty. However, what was actually being said in Aboriginal English, okay, I'm going to translate this, Jumbotty should name that school. What was actually being said in formal English is that somebody else, right, Jumbotty, somebody else should name that school. Don't ask me, because I don't know enough about what the name of the school should be. There is, however, a school in the Pilbara currently named Jumbotty. Now, amusing as that may be, there's a long list of this that I could share, but it's we're running out of time. However, what the point of this whole small conversation is that is a couple of examples of how a top-down service model doesn't work. From an evidence-based point of view, you only need to review the stats out of the 2022 Closing the Gap report, that 3 out of the 7 are going backwards. 1 out of the 7 are on neutral ground. 3 are within target. The sad consequence of that is just abject poverty and all sorts of diabolical consequences for Indigenous Australians. So it's not working. It's worth a try that the bottom-up model is given a shot. Okay, I want to thank Richard and Holly for working with me on this project, and I want to thank you for listening to this recording. This has been John. Thank you for your time and your trouble, and it's incumbent at this point that I again note this video has been shot in the Irukandji and Yidinji lands up in Cairns in far north Queensland. Thank you for your time and your trouble.